They dreamed of freedom, of never worrying about bills, of luxury vacations, mansions, sports cars. But when the impossible became real, their lives didn't get better. They descended into chaos. This is not a single story, but a pattern. An eerie truth behind what should have been a dream come true. What if winning the lottery is not a blessing, but a curse? It started on a Thursday. The sky above Dayton, Ohio, was a uniform shade of gray, the kind that made the streets feel colder than they were. Thomas Rourke wiped the grease from his hands with a rag that had long since given up its original color. The factory floor buzzed with the low hum of machines, and the air carried a metallic scent that had become as familiar to him as the back of his calloused hands. At 52, Thomas had resigned himself to a life of repetition. Wake up, work, go home. Sometimes he stopped by the VFW hall for a cheap beer and a laugh, but most nights he sat in silence, staring at the flickering TV in his modest two-bedroom house. His wife, Denise, had passed from breast cancer 6 years earlier, and his 2 adult children had drifted away to lives filled with their own obligations and disappointments. But that Thursday changed everything. During his lunch break, Thomas wandered into the gas station across from the plant. He didn't usually play the lottery. A tax on the desperate, he used to say. But the jackpot was flashing on the little neon sign by the register. 98 million. It was obscene, irrational, tempting. He bought a single Powerball ticket. More out of boredom than hope. Then he folded it and tucked it into the back pocket of his jeans, forgetting about it completely until 3 days later, when a news report mentioned the winning numbers. He checked them. Once, then again, then a third time, heart thudding so loudly he could barely hear the anchor's voice. He had all of them, every single one. In that moment, Thomas's world tilted on its axis. The walls of his living room, the battered recliner, the faded carpet, all of it felt unreal, like a set piece in someone else's life. He sat down, ticket in hand, and began to cry. The news spread faster than he could control. The Ohio Lottery Commission announced him as the winner after he came forward, his face plastered across every local channel. They gave him a choice: lump sum or annuity. He took the lump sum, $58.3 million after taxes. Suddenly, Thomas was not just Thomas. He was Thomas Rourke, local Powerball winner. A man whose face people recognized in grocery stores and bank lobbies. A man who was now officially unfathomably rich. He bought a new truck the same day the money hit his account. A cherry-red Ford F-150, fully loaded. Then came the house, a sprawling 5-bedroom on the edge of town, complete with a pool, heated, floors, and a wine cellar he had no idea how to use. He started giving out money to family, friends, co-workers. He paid off mortgages, student loans, hospital bills. For a time, he was a legend. But the change wasn't just financial, it was chemical. Winning shifted something in Thomas's DNA. His nervous laughter turned into bold declarations. His careful nature, honed through years of budgeting every dime, was replaced with reckless generosity and impulsiveness. He started drinking more, eating out every night, buying things he didn't need simply because he could. One evening, he stood on the balcony of his new home, staring out at the town he once knew, the wind cold against his face. Beneath the surface of joy, there was unease, an ache he couldn't quite place. He had the money, the freedom, the power. So why did he feel so hollow? The lottery ticket had been golden, but Thomas, in his gut, was beginning to suspect that it might also be poisoned. It began with a knock. 3 days after Thomas's story made local headlines, a man named Greg showed up at his gate. He was an old friend. At least, that's what Greg claimed. They had gone to high school together, played on the same football team. Thomas vaguely remembered the name but couldn't place the face. Still, he invited him in. That night, they drank bourbon in the living room of Thomas's new estate. Greg laughed loud, told stories about the good old days, and before he left, he handed Thomas a thin proposal for a surefire investment in a line of food trucks. Thomas, basking in his newfound identity as a millionaire philanthropist, wrote him a check for $50,000 without blinking. Greg was the first. Then came the neighbors he hadn't spoken to in 20 years. The ex-co-workers who always believed in him. A cousin from Texas who claimed to be dying of leukemia. Old acquaintances emerged like shadows at dusk, each with a smile, a handshake, and a favor. At first, Thomas gave freely. It felt good. It gave him purpose, filled the void that money alone could not. He hosted barbecues for the community, paid for strangers' groceries, tipped waitresses $500 at roadside diners. He was no longer invisible. He was admired, envied, praised. But soon the admiration turned parasitic. People camped outside his home. Reporters dug through his trash. Private messages on social media became public pleas for help or veiled threats. A woman he didn't know mailed him a photo of her child and a letter that read, "You could save her life. Why won't you?" Another man claimed to be his illegitimate son. The pressure mounted. Thomas hired a financial advisor named Rachel, a sharp-tongued woman with a background in hedge funds. She warned him bluntly that he was burning through his winnings at an alarming rate. "You're not a bank, Thomas," she said, "and these people aren't your friends." But he didn't want to hear it. He fired her 3 weeks later. With no one to say no, Thomas said yes to everything. He bought his daughter a luxury condo in Chicago, then spent a fortune furnishing it, only to find out she had dropped out of college and was dating a man twice her age who specialized in crypto ventures. His son asked for startup money to launch a mobile app he couldn't even describe. Thomas gave it to him anyway. He sponsored local sports teams, funded a failed documentary, even backed a musician who called himself DJ Profit, and swore he was the next big thing. When DJ Profit disappeared with $80,000, Thomas didn't report it. He just drank more. The fame had infected him. He started wearing designer clothes, attending gala events he didn't understand, flying to Las Vegas on private jets with people he barely knew. Every selfie posted, every comment liked. It fed an invisible hunger he hadn't known existed. Yet despite the followers, the fame, and the flood of requests, Thomas felt lonelier than ever. The people who surrounded him weren't real. They smiled when he handed out money, but their eyes were cold. He was no longer Thomas, the man. He was Thomas, the wallet. And somewhere deep inside, he knew. The moment the money ran out, so would they. One night, he stood in the center of his marble-tiled kitchen, staring at the glistening appliances he'd never used. He poured himself another drink, then whispered, into the silence, "What the hell have I done? What do you think so far? Would you be able to say no to everyone if you won the lottery? Or would you fall into the same trap as Thomas?" The fall didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, like hairline cracks in glass, invisible at first, until the whole thing shattered. By the second year of his windfall, Thomas Rourke had spent over $30 million. What remained was scattered across unstable ventures, toxic relationships, and properties he rarely visited. His mansion, once bustling with guests and laughter, now echoed with silence and the occasional sound of a drink being poured. The first, real blow came from within. It started with Denise's sister, Mary Ann. She had always been close to Thomas, especially after Denise's death. When she came to him asking for help to launch a wellness retreat in Arizona, he agreed. She had the passion, she had the plan, she just didn't have the experience or the discipline. Months later, Thomas found out the retreat was a front. Mary Ann had siphoned the funds into personal accounts and disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye, just a void where trust used. To be next came the lawsuit. A former friend, one of the first he had helped, accused him of verbal agreements never made, claiming Thomas had promised him a partnership in a business that never existed. The court costs, settlements, and attorney fees drained another $500,000. The media devoured the story like vultures. From fortune to fraud, the headlines read. Thomas tried to find relief in the bottle. He drank morning coffee spiked with whiskey, began canceling meetings, missed his son's engagement party. The shame grew heavier than the money ever had. One night he met a woman named Celia at a private charity event. She was radiant, poised, and just the kind of escape he needed. She was also younger by 2 decades, and unbeknownst to him already, married to a man who had spent 6 months researching Thomas's net worth. Within 3 weeks, she moved in. Celia introduced him to high-risk investments, crypto tokens no one had heard of, art pieces with fabricated provenance, NFTs tied to AI-generated poetry. She spoke with confidence, and Thomas, desperate for connection and purpose, listened. By the time he discovered she'd been siphoning money into offshore accounts with her real husband, it was too late. Over $8 million had vanished. Celia was gone. The authorities weren't interested. Consensual mismanagement, his lawyer said. Thomas snapped. He punched through a mirror. Spent a night in jail after trying to drive his Lamborghini into a fountain outside a hotel. The mugshot made the rounds online. Comments poured in. Should have stayed broke. Another idiot who couldn't handle money. Typical lottery story. He checked himself into rehab 3 days later. Not for alcohol, though he needed it, but for prescription opioids he'd been quietly abusing. Back pain, stress, insomnia. It all spiraled into addiction. Rehab was a blur. He met other broken men. Some had once been wealthy. Some had never tasted a dollar of luck. But they all shared the same hollow stare. Thomas felt like he belonged among them. When he got out, the mansion was gone, sold off to pay debts. The cars, too. Most of his investments were either seized, worthless, or under investigation. He moved into a small condo above a pawn shop he had once tried to buy. No pool, no wine cellar. Just a mattress, a radio, and a window overlooking a gas station. He looked at himself in the mirror one morning and hardly recognized the man staring back. Gray stubble, sunken eyes, and a bitterness etched deep into his face. The smile of a lottery winner was gone. What remained was a ghost of a man who had once believed money would fix everything. The implosion wasn't loud. It was slow, methodical, and worst of all, it was entirely his own doing. The wind clawed at the sides of the trailer like some invisible predator trying to get in. Snow had piled halfway up the front door, and the metal steps were iced over, slick with a deadly shine. Inside, Thomas Rourke sat on a stained mattress, wrapped in a threadbare army blanket, staring at the flickering blue light of a dying television. Static crackled like whispers from another life. There was no heat. The propane had run out 3 nights ago. He'd rationed the last of it, trying to make it through the storm, but the cold didn't care. It moved through walls and into his bones. Each breath felt like inhaling broken glass. This was what rock bottom looked like. The trailer was a rusted box on the edge of a forgotten Ohio town, parked illegally behind a shuttered service station. Thomas had bribed the owner to let him stay, paying with the last valuable thing he owned, an antique pocket watch that once belonged to his grandfather. It was the only item he'd kept through the years of chaos, but now sentiment had no value. Survival did. He hadn't spoken to his children in 8 months. His calls went unanswered, texts ignored. They'd moved on, disgusted or ashamed, maybe both. Once, he heard from his son. A voicemail filled with slurred accusations and disappointment. "You threw it all away, Dad. Everything." That message played in his head every night as he tried to sleep through the cold. His body ached constantly. Years of substance abuse, depression, and neglect had reduced him to a shell. His once strong frame was now emaciated, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. He barely recognized himself in the cracked mirror above the sink. That mirror had spiderwebbed months ago when he punched it in a fit of rage after reading yet another article mocking his downfall. The headline had read, "From Millionaire to Meth Head? The Thomas Rourke Spiral." He wasn't a meth addict, but he had flirted with opioids, whatever he could get his hands on during the darker periods. Painkillers from street dealers, tranquilizers from dubious clinics. He'd stopped not because he wanted to, but because he could no longer afford the numbness. His mind was the cruelest prison. He replayed every decision, the people he trusted, the warnings he ignored, the greed he mistook for generosity. There were so many chances to change course, and yet he never did. Each new opportunity became a new way to self-destruct. Thomas wasn't just broke. He was forgotten. A ghost in a town that had once hailed him as a hero. The news trucks had stopped coming. The letters from opportunists had dried up. Even the scammers had moved on to fresher prey. He was no longer useful, just another silent failure. One morning, after a particularly brutal night, he stood outside the trailer as the sun struggled to rise through the gray sky. His breath hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment he felt weightless. He stared, down at his frost-bitten fingers, trembling from hunger and cold, and whispered to no one, "What am I still doing here?" He considered walking into the woods and not coming back, but something small and stupid and stubborn kept him anchored. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was survival instinct. Or maybe it was the memory of Denise's laugh echoing in the back of his mind, still untainted by time or regret, so he went back inside. Sat on the mattress, pulled the blanket tighter, and waited for the next hour to pass. Ashes to awakening. It started with a knock, not loud, not demanding, but deliberate. A sound so out of place in the quiet of Thomas's desolation that it startled him upright. He hadn't heard someone knock in months. Not since the sheriff came to warn him about squatting laws. Not since society had fully closed its doors to him. He shuffled to the trailer's entrance, his body stiff from days of cold and underuse. When he opened it, he saw a familiar face. Darren Finch, the guy who used to grease the lines at the old factory. He was thicker now, bearded, a few more wrinkles around the eyes, but the smile was the same. "I heard what happened," Darren said. "No pity, just presence. You want to grab some real food? That meal at the local diner wasn't about calories. It was about memory, of being seen not as a mistake, but as a man." Darren didn't ask about the money. He didn't talk about the downfall. He talked about life, about things that mattered. Before they parted ways, Darren handed him a creased business card. "I opened a shop," he said. "We're short a guy. It's not glamorous, but it's steady." Thomas stared at the card for a week. Each day he didn't go felt like another choice to drown. But on the 8th day, he walked through the snow, card in hand, and pushed open the garage door. The shop was noisy, chaotic, and smelled like burnt oil and effort. Darren handed him a pair of gloves and said, "If you're ready, you've got a lift." No speeches, no judgment, just a lifeline. At first, Thomas was slow. The tools felt unfamiliar, his muscles weak. But work has a way of healing the mind. That money never can. He changed tires. He replaced belts. He swept the floor and took the trash out with the same hands that once signed million-dollar checks. With each day came a fragment of clarity. He stopped buying lottery tickets. He started drinking water. He cooked his own food. Nothing fancy, just warm and made by his own effort. Weeks turned into months. The pain in his chest began to ease. Not from medicine, but from meaning. Thomas was still living in the trailer, but it was no longer a tomb. He patched the leaks, bought a small heater, planted tomatoes in old paint buckets outside. On his daughter's birthday, he mailed her a letter, not asking for forgiveness, just sharing. A recipe she used to love when Denise was alive. She didn't reply, but he kept writing, every birthday, every holiday, hoping that one day, silence would break. At the local shelter, he volunteered on Saturdays. He knew their faces, knew the stories, knew what it felt like to be invisible. And so he sat with them, listened, shared. Not because he was better, but because he understood. One day, a reporter called. She wanted to revisit his story. From fortune to failure to fight back. He declined. "I'm not a story," he said. "I'm just living." He had no social media, no fanfare, no need to prove anything anymore. The lottery had stripped him bare, but in the ashes of his ego, he found something that wealth never bought: peace. And as the sun dipped behind the trees one evening, Thomas sat on his steps with dirt under his nails and a cup of cheap coffee, watching the wind bend the tomato plants ever so slightly. He smiled. Not because life was perfect, but because it was finally honest. Sometimes rock bottom isn't the end. Sometimes it's where you finally stop falling. Thomas Rourke's journey wasn't just a fall from grace. It was a dissection of the illusion we've all been sold, that money will solve everything. But the truth is darker. For some, sudden wealth doesn't bring liberation. It brings exposure. Every fracture in Thomas's life, every buried trauma and unresolved grief, was amplified by money. And once the bills were gone, the real debt came due. Emotional, relational, spiritual. But this story isn't just about failure. It's about reckoning. It's about crawling through the wreckage and learning to live again, without applause, without fame, just with integrity. Thomas found that healing doesn't come in the form of zeros on a bank statement. It comes in quiet mornings, honest work, and the decision to keep going when the world turns its back. So we ask you, if you were given everything overnight, would you survive it? Or would it destroy you too? Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episode in our series of real-life financial stories that are as haunting as they are human. And tell us in the comments, do you believe in the lottery? Curse? Don't forget to watch the next story. It might just be more unbelievable than this one.